Your billionaire husband, his beautiful ex-girlfriend is trying to steal him back. She is actually trying to get you assassinated. Julia left her mob boss husband because she thought he was cheating with a gorgeous, arrogant woman at their gate. Major plot twist. That woman was a spy for the Calabrian cartel, actively feeding them intel on Julia's exact daily schedule. Now, hiding out 7 months pregnant, Julia gets a terrifying phone call. Can Matteo destroy the cartel before they cash in on her unborn baby? I have sat in dozens of these rooms, the kind built entirely for bitter endings. You and I are going to unpack this case file together, starting with this exact scene. It was a sterile office overlooking the grey Milan skyline. A lawyer sat at a long mahogany table, clutching a silver pen, sweating through his expensive suit. He was right to be terrified. Matteo Rinaldi was already waiting by the window. In my clinical experience, men like Matteo use stillness as a weapon. He stood with his back to the door, hands clasped, exposing the dark ink creeping up his neck and down his forearms. Those tattoos were markers of a severe antisocial personality. The lesson here is simple. Never mistake a predator's quiet for peace. The letters inked across his knuckles told a story of early trauma, though he had buried that part of his psyche years ago. For 11 minutes he stood frozen. Then the heavy office door clicked open. Now, I have evaluated cartel bosses and men who sleep soundly after car bombs go off, but when Julia walked in, Matteo suffered a complete nervous system freeze. She entered with the haunting grace typical of those conditioned by long-term psychological capture. Her chestnut hair was pinned up loosely. She wore a heavy camel coat over a simple ivory dress that fell to her calves. Her composure was a classic survival mechanism, projecting calm to pacify a volatile threat. Sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones carrying the heaviest survival instincts. Notice her eye contact, or rather, the lack of it. She avoided looking at him, setting her bag down and smoothing her dress to ground herself. When she finally looked up, the physical truth was impossible to ignore. She was 7 months pregnant. That ivory dress stretched tight over a reality she had hidden from a highly controlling, megalomaniacal partner for the better part of a year. Hiding a pregnancy from a man like Matteo requires a dangerous level of cognitive dissonance. He finally turned from the window, and you could practically hear Kadia's pathological need for control shatter as his eyes dropped to her stomach. We are about to look at exactly how this traumatic bond formed, because you cannot understand the break until you study the attachment. 18 months prior, Julia Orsi was entirely unaware she was walking into a classic cycle of narcissistic abuse. They met at a charity gala in Florence, a high society masquerade where wealth covered up an endless supply of dark character flaws. She was just a guest, hiding in a borrowed blue dress, gripping a glass of champagne like a shield. She stood alone, staring at a reproductive painting on the far wall, though just to avoid the hollow social interactions around her. Then he materialized beside her. Predators of his classification are notoriously silent when stalking. They do not announce their presence until they are already inside your personal boundary. The lesson here is to always trust your body when it senses someone stepping too close, too quietly. A man standing 6'3" with that much physical mass should not be able to sneak up on anyone. He was built like a heavyweight fighter, broad and imposing, with dark eyes and a hard jawline. Even in a tailored black blight, his prison ink was on full display, but that blatant disregard for social norms is a textbook indicator of supreme arrogance. He told her she was studying the wrong painting. Julia did not look at him right away, a tiny attempt to maintain her own autonomy, She told him there was a different painting nearby with more honest emotion. Then she made the fatal error that victims of magnetic personalities often make. She met his gaze directly. His eyes were entirely devoid of warmth, black, and in the light of the chandeliers. His gaze was like dead water. It was not overtly aggressive, just frighteningly deep and detached. He introduced himself as Matteo Rinaldi, offering a hand marked by thick knuckle tattoos. Against her better judgment, she gave him her hand and her name. He simply lied that he already knew who she was. That is the chilling hallmark of a clinical stalker. He began a calculated grooming process, pursuing her with the absolute rigid certainty that she belonged to him. Yet he masked his pathology with overwhelming grand gestures, a phase we call love bombing. He sent untraceable flowers and bought out her favorite restaurant on a random Tuesday, pretending it was a happy accident. A dangerous person often wraps their control in the disguise of perfect romance. Today, you and I are going to unpack a textbook case of psychological manipulation. When Julia first met Matteo, he deployed a classic predatory technique. He made her feel specifically, deliberately chosen. As a behavioral analyst, I see this pattern constantly. She knew the Raldi family name. She grew up on the frayed edges of Milan, the daughter of a minor bookkeeper who had mismanaged the wrong syndicate's account, but the Matteo sitting before her did not match the underworld ghost stories. He was deeply attentive. He asked penetrating questions and waited for genuine answers. To a megalomaniacal narcissist, this is simply the acquisition phase. He studied her like a puzzle, not a possession. And just like that, the trap snapped shut. She fell in love with him the exact same way a person falls asleep. 8 months after that first gala, the psychological bindings were secured with a marriage at his private estate. She wore white, he wore black. He even produced a single tear as she walked down the aisle, a calculated mechanism to cement her emotional dependency. For 4 months, Julia lived in the euphoria of the honeymoon phase. Then, the cognitive dissonance began. The fractures started small. A suddenly canceled dinner, a phone call that instantly emptied the room, a locked study she instinctively learned never to question. Unknown men arriving at 2 in the morning, ushered in without a word of explanation. She was not a naive woman. Consciously, she knew exactly the kind of man she was marrying, but recognizing the dark reality and actually surviving it are 2 entirely different clinical states. The night her illusion shattered was Wednesday in October. Unable to sleep, Julia sat in the dimly lit kitchen. Through a cracked window, she heard voices in the garden. One was Matteo. He spoke in that low, terrifyingly controlled cadence a megalomaniacal narcissist uses when issuing a final judgment. "Handle it," he commanded. "Handle it, and make sure there is nothing to find." She never discovered the context of that fatal order. Instead, her brain engaged a severe defense mechanism, a classic symptom of Stockholm Syndrome. She convinced herself his words meant something innocent. For 6 full weeks, she repeated this lie, her mind desperately trying to protect her from the trauma. But her psychological barrier completely collapsed when a strange woman arrived at the Abyss while Matteo was out of town. The visitor was draped in expensive clothes, wielding her beauty like a weapon. She asked for Matteo with the casual authority of someone deeply entrenched in his dark world. When approached the gate, the woman scanned her from her plain cardigan down to her wedding ring. She offered a smile engineered to inflict maximum psychological damage. "I did not know he had replaced me so quickly," she stated, adding that Julia was likely just a placeholder. Julia suffered an immediate acute stress response. She walked back into the house and sat frozen in the kitchen for 40 minutes, desperately struggling to regulate her breathing. When Matteo finally returned and she confronted him, he deployed a classic narcissistic deflection. He did not deny knowing the woman. He simply stared at his wife with cold eyes and claimed the situation was complicated. He categorized the betrayal as old history. He told her she did not need to worry, clinically speaking, and it is what he omitted that finally shattered her trauma bond. He never said the affair was over. He never reaffirmed her worth. That precise condescending dismissal broke the psychological hold he had over her. She executed her escape on a cold Sunday morning in January. For 2 weeks, she planned her departure with the detached, methodical efficiency of a survivalist. There was no theatrical argument, no desperate plea for closure. She knew that if she allowed herself actually to access the profound grief, emotional paralysis would trap her there forever. She packed exactly one suitcase. She placed her wedding ring on the cold granite of the kitchen counter, leaving nothing behind but a single, brief letter. The letter contained no accusations. It read like a factual statement. I cannot be the person you do need me to be in the life you have chosen. Goodbye, Matteo. She severed the connection entirely. What she did not know was that she was already pregnant.
3 weeks later, inside a clinic in Turin, a smiling nurse delivered the news. Julia sat entirely frozen.
In my years of analyzing broken lives, here is the simple truth I always return to. Sometimes saving your own sanity requires stepping into absolute, terrifying isolation. The months that followed were brutal. She was structurally alone in a way few ever experience. No husband, no family, just a spare room in a friend's apartment and a child growing inside her, permanently tying her bloodline to the dangerous narcissist she had just sacrificed everything to escape. Let us look closely to Matteo here. She made her choices with cold detachment, studying every outcome the way an investigator processes a scene. Keeping the pregnancy a secret from Matteo was pure survival instinct. She needed that divorce finalized to establish her own baseline. I have analyzed many individuals who use a child as a weapon when a marriage collapses, but she rejected that pathology. Trapping him would only trap herself in a cage of resentment. Instead, she secured a controlled environment in Turin, a quiet apartment catching the afternoon sun, and enrolled in a design course to keep her mind sharp. At the end of the day, the healthiest choice any of us can make is to build a solid foundation alone before asking anyone else to stand on it.
Let us open the case file on Julia and Matteo. Today, you and I will unpack this dynamic together. We observe the subject, Julia, exhibiting classic compartmentalization.
5 months pregnant before securing counsel, maturely constructed an independent survival framework. She selected Avocado Ferrante, a practitioner known for clinical detachment, mirroring her own necessary dissociation. For 6 months, her estranged husband, Matteo Rinaldi, refused to validate the separation. Now, in this sterile room, Matteo anchors himself by the window, his knuckles white against the mahogany, is a megalomaniacal narcissist losing control. The lesson here is brutal but necessary. True independence always requires a severing the invisible strings of our captors, no matter how it hurts. Matteo's hyperfixation is immediate and unbroken. His gaze tracks Julia like a predator evaluating a sudden shift in its immediate territory. Julia, deploying highly practiced emotional blunting, meets this intense scrutiny without yielding. She smooths her coat, a self-soothing gesture, and addresses the lawyer with deliberate, even tones. "Avocado Ferrante, shall we begin?" she asks. Matteo remains entirely nonverbal. This silent dominance is a classic tactic of the narcissistic profile, forcing the environment to bend to his quiet authority. Near the end stands Enzo, the enforcer. His facial microexpressions betray a stark cognitive dissonance. In studying these dynamics, we learn a simple truth. Silence is never empty. In the hands of an abuser, it is a loaded weapon. Enzo's internal conflict is fascinating to observe. Previously, he demonstrated authentic warmth toward Julia, a rare deviation from the sociopathic baseline required in Matteo's syndicate. Now, his eyes lock onto her physical state, rapidly calculating the timeline. Ferrante's junior associate foolishly attempts to direct the megalomaniacal narcissist. Who? Matteo asks. His response is a barely audible whisper. In behavioral analysis, we categorize this drop in volume as the most severe threat indicator. The associate demands, who is the father? Entirely ignorant of the volatile pathology he is triggering. It is a stark reminder for all of us. When dealing with apex predators, demanding answers is often the fastest way to become the prey. Observe how Julia's autonomic nerve system responds. The familiar neurological pathway of anger ignites, yet her trauma response remains managed. That is not relevant to the terms of the divorce. She states, rightfully denying them her medical data. It is relevant to me, Matteo counters. He weaponizes her name, vocalizing it with a heavy transactional weight. When Julia clinically redirects the focus, saying, "Let us proceed," Matteo emits a visceral, choking sound. It is the physiological rebellion of a narcissist being forced to swallow an undeniable loss of power. He finally sits, projecting a gravitational field of intimidation. The psychological lesson is clear. Your oppressor will always view your personal boundaries as a direct, unforgivable attack on their existence. Matteo's vocal control tightens into the most lethal variation of his pathology. 6 months, he calculates aloud, his jaw clenching as the narcissistic injury deepens. You were already pregnant when you left. You knew. Juliet's response is devoid of emotional resonance. "I did not know," she states. "I found out after." The atmospheric tension becomes almost toxic. Ferrante engages in displacement behavior, studying a pen, while his associate stares upward, neutralized. Enzo adopts the absolute stillness of an animal, anticipating violence. Matteo obsessively repeats the chronological data, trapped in the cognitive loop of his shattered ego. We must remember this fundamental reality. You can never reason with a mind that has actively chosen to live inside its own delusion. You and I must pay close attention to this specific interaction, as it reveals the core of their trauma bond. Julia maintains unflinching eye contact, a monumental triumph over her deeply ingrained Stockholm syndrome. "I needed time to decide whether I wanted you involved," she states. For a fraction of a second, Matteo's emotional suppression fails. His voice fractures before he violently flattens it. She watches him internalize this judgment, studying the opaque, sociopathic gazes she once desperately tried to humanize. "I decided that the child deserves to know who his father is," she concludes, removing his ego entirely from the equation. The lesson is sobering. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to fix the symptoms and start protecting the innocent instead. Matteo processes her statement with a prolonged diagnostic silence. He then initiates a display of absolute spatial dominance, rising to reclaim the perimeter by the window. "Leave us," he commands. When the junior lawyer falters, Matteo's tone turns glacial. "Leave now." Julia, exhibiting remarkable nervous system regulation, nods at her attorney to comply. Within 30 seconds, the civilian variables are removed. Injury remains kept as a psychological anchor. Julia does not retreat. She plants her hands on the mahogany, studying the dark silhouette of her abuser reflected in the glass. Is it mine? He asks the window. Yes, her affirmation is absolute. The profound truth here is that confronting your deepest grief often requires sitting quietly in the very room with it. The physical reaction is instantaneous. Matteo pivots with such kinetic force that the atmospheric pressure in the room visibly alters. He bridges the gap in 4 precise strides, halting directly at her boundary line. This is a classic intimidation metric, yet, upon closer inspection, Julia observes the physiological toll of his narcissistic collapse. The megalomaniac is deteriorating. His face remains hardened, but severe sleep deprivation has carved dark hollows beneath his eyes. Strikingly, the ink on his neck, spelling out loyalty, contrasts sharply against an unnatural pallor. His physical vessel is actively failing. We learn a haunting lesson from this decay. True control is an illusion, and the desperate pursuit of it will eventually destroy the very vessel that seeks it. We see a brief resurgence of her Stockholm syndrome here, as Julia momentarily empathizes with his physical degradation. She understands as intuitively that his starvation is not born of grief, but from the frantic hunt to reclaim his possession. A boy, he whispers, and a microscopic fracture appears in his sociopathic armor. I would have wanted to be there, he confesses. His heavily tattooed hand suspends in the space between them, a phantom gesture unable to bridge the chasm of his own pathology. I would have come, Julia, if you had told me. Her response is utterly devoid of illusion. I know, she replies. The vital lesson for any survivor is this. Just because a predator feels as a fleeting moment of human sorrow does not mean they have stopped being a predator. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Julia S. rationale is a masterpiece of self-preservation. That is why I did not tell you, she confirms, stating that his presence would have overridden her autonomy. Enzo averts his gaze, unable to witness the Kingpin-esque psychological unraveling. Matteo retracts his hand, executing a terrifying display of emotional regulation. He banks his internal rage with the mechanical precision of a psychopath regaining baseline. Turning away, he shifts into intelligence-gathering mode. You are living in Turin, he states as absolute fact. Julia experienced no shock at this surveillance. The reality we must all accept is quite simple. Peace is never found by hiding from the dark, but by learning to walk steadily through it without breaking. Julia attempts to establish a boundary, outlining her independent living arrangements way. Matteo instantly demolishes this illusion of autonomy. You are not going back to Turin, he dictates. When she protests, his demeanor shifts into total pathological ownership. I am not going to allow my son to be born in a city 3 hours from me, he declares. His vocal tone remains entirely flat, completely devoid of standard emotional inflection, yet it radiates an undercurrent of supreme violent authority. He outright rejects the legal theater, declaring he will never permit his biological heir to exist outside his control. This teaches us a grim life lesson. An abuser does not view you as a partner to negotiate with, but as a stolen possession they must violently reclaim. Matteo explicitly weaponizes his non-compliance. I have not signed those papers in X months, and I am not signing them today, he confirms. This was a calculated psychological siege. Leaning heavily onto the mahogany table, he deploys the full, suffocating weight of his presence. Come home. This directive is specifically engineered to target the residual neural pathways of her Stockholm syndrome. Julia identifies the manipulation immediately. That is not an option, she holds firm. When he claims he is merely asking, she deconstructs his facade. You are not asking, you are instructing. she replies. The most important lesson in any abusive dynamic is realizing that their affection is just another form of instruction disguised to keep you obedient. As we reach the conclusion of this interaction, notice how Julia finally confronts the inciting incident of her departure. I heard you, she reveals, referencing a conversation in the garden, a moment of undeniable criminal reality that shattered her cognitive dissonance forever. Matteo attempts to gaslight her, but she abruptly terminates his narrative control. Standing up, severely burdened by the pregnancy, she reestablishes her boundaries. It is a good offer, Matteo. Take it, she instructs. As she moves toward the exit, Matteo engages in a classic physical blocking maneuver, forcing her to confront his unyielding authority. The ultimate lesson of her survival is this: you can never wait for a captor to grant you freedom. You simply have to stand up and walk through the door. Let us open this case file together and observe the subject, Matteo. Notice how he positions himself between Julia and the door. He maintains a respectful distance, yet his sheer presence methodically suffocates the room. He tells her she looks exhausted, weaponizing his concern. It is a textbook tactic of the megalomaniacal narcissist to keep the victim perpetually off balance. Julia anticipates his typical rage, the cold, calculated fury she knows so intimately. She expects legal threats and brute force. Instead, he offers an observation disguised as empathy. She forces her face into a neutral mask, a classic survival response in high-stress environments. Then he drops her name. Julia, a calculated psychological weight. Let me take you to lunch, he says. It sounds like an invitation, but it is an absolute directive. There is no room for negotiation. Observe the physical indicators of his restrained violence, the tattooed skin. You see cross his knuckles, shifting as he grips the chair. He notes her fasting, her long journey, cataloging her vulnerabilities. You need to eat, he dictates. When she asserts that this changes nothing, Matteo issues a remarkable response. He simply says, I know. In my years analyzing criminal pathology, an admission of defeat from a narcissist is never a surrender. It is strategic retreat. It is a microscopic shift in the dynamic, yet entirely monumental. Julia exhales, the tension leaving her nervous system. She grants him 1 hour, just us. He replies smoothly. No lawyers, no handlers, just the predator and the prey in a controlled environment. Psychologically speaking, she should have refused. She recognizes the peril. Julia possesses enough self-awareness to understand that isolation is the cornerstone of Stockholm Syndrome. The phrase "just us" represents the ultimate psychological danger when spoken by her captor. Yet, the trauma bond holds firm, and she complies. They arrive at an aging, dimly lit establishment, precisely chosen by Matteo to limit external observation. He has orchestrated the environment in advance, securing a corner table that offers tactical privacy. He dictates the seating. He dictates the consumption. Notice how he orders a single glass of wine for himself and still water for her, bypassing her input entirely. He remembers her prenatal aversions perfectly. This is not simple thoughtfulness. It is a demonstration of omniscient surveillance, reminding her that he monitors her every biological need. You and I must understand the duality of Matteo Raldi. His memory functions like a vast, deeply categorized archive. He stores every preference, every micro-expression, every passing comment his victim ever makes. During the idealization phase of the narcissistic cycle, this obsessive attention mimics profound romantic devotion. During the devaluation phase, it reveals itself as inescapable surveillance. He clinically inquires about the pregnancy, gathering biological data. Normal, she answers, offering nothing extra. He physically places bread on her plate, an automatic gesture ingrained from years of systemic conditioning. He does not ask, he acts. These phantom limbs of their shared intimacy twitch instinctively, a behavioral loop neither has fully unlearned. She internalizes the violation and remains entirely silent. He interrogates her residential plans, probing her newfound independence in Turin. As he slowly turns his glass, the ambient light catches the ink, knuckles, rising above his collar. Even in a tailored suit, the underlying threat of violence radiates from his posture. He is an apex predator attempting to mimic domesticity. Despite the profound psychological damage he has inflicted, Julia bridges a dangerous emotional relapse. She has missed him every single day for 6 months. This is the tragic reality of traumatic bonding. The nervous system craves the very source of its destruction, yet she engages her prefrontal cortex, forcing herself to recognize that longing is merely a chemical withdrawal symptom, not a valid reason to return to the cage. The manipulation enters a new phase. He demands access to the birth. He claims he is not asking to alter the legal terms or demanding her submission. He appeals entirely to his biological status as the father, weaponizing the very co-parenting clause she instituted to protect her child. Allow me to observe his facial expressions in this critical moment. The clinical armor drops. The defensive strategies vanish. His dark eyes project a radical, devastating vulnerability. It is a terrifyingly effective technique. True sociopaths know exactly when to reveal genuine emotion to maximize psychological impact. She recognizes this look from their past, a ghost from an altar in Florence. Unable to process the conflicting data between his violent history and this raw display, she breaks eye contact and stares blankly at the window. The city of Milan continues its mundane rhythm outside the glass, entirely oblivious to the psychological warfare occurring at the Scatorna table. I will think about it, she concedes. He accepts this without pushing, a calculated display of restraint. They consume their meal in a profound, heavy silence. In this quiet void, Julia feels the insidious creep of the idealization phase returning. It mimics the early days, the golden period before the isolation and control began. Her brain desperately wants us to believe in the illusion, the manufactured romantic fantasy of his inherent goodness, but survival demands vigilance. She actively suppresses the trauma response,
mentally fortifying her boundaries. She tightens her grip on reality and leans forward. You should know, she states, preparing to dissect their fracture.
Here, we witness the subject attempting to explain profound emotional starvation to a megalomaniac.
She tells him the rupture was not merely a single betrayal or a specific incident in the garden.
It was the crushing cumulative weight of his pathology. She articulates the agonizing reality of loving a man whose primary attachment is to his own power, his own empire. I felt like a room in your house, she explains. Beautifully decorated, perfectly maintained, but permanently locked behind a heavy door. This is a brilliant metaphor for narcissistic objectification. She correctly identifies his core cognitive distortion. She tells him that his instinct to protect is indistinguishable from his need to imprison. To him, love and absolute control are synonymous. Matteo stops moving. The tattooed muscles in his forearms tense against the wood. The ink on his skin twists as he absorbs her assessment. Then comes the shock.
All right, he admits.
The repetition of this phrase indicates a massive psychological rupture. He confesses his inability to differentiate between emotional intimacy and tactical defense. He acknowledges his walls, the rigid defense mechanisms that prevent any genuine human connection. Eyes, and the word hangs in the air, dripping with sudden repulsive clarity. For the very first time, he is hearing his own sociopathic vernacular. He processes his spouse not as a human being, but as a volatile situation requiring risk management, a liability to be mitigated. The silence that follows is radically altered. It is no longer the silence of a predator and prey, but the heavy electric quiet of a delusion finally cracking open. Stick with me here, because this is where his justification mechanisms are entirely exposed. She demands to know the catalyst for this sudden self-awareness. He points to the biological reality of his wife, and sitting right across from him, exactly 7 months pregnant. He details his months of insomnia and obsessive monitoring, confessing he deployed operatives to track her movements under the guise of protection. "You were having me stalked," she translates plainly, cutting through his romanticized narrative. He insists he was ensuring her safety, clinging to the delusion that surveillance is love. "There is a distinction," he argues. "There really is not," she counters with clinical precision. He absorbs the blow. He does not attack. He simply accepts the truth of his own pathology. "I know," he murmurs. Within 48 hours, she retreats to the geographical safety of Turin. She maintains a strategic ambiguity with her legal counsel, offering no firm decisions. Sitting on the train, she physically guards her abdomen, murmuring to the unborn child. This behavior is a common grounding technique for trauma survivors, a way to anchor themselves to the present when the past threatens to drag them under. "He is never what I expect," she whispers. This unpredictability is precisely why the trauma bond remains so highly addictive. Her nervous system is constantly waiting for the next behavioral shift. Upon arriving home, she is greeted by Serena, a vital component of her newly constructed support system. Serena provides warmth and stability, the psychological antithesis of the chaotic, high-stakes environment Matteo actively cultivates. Serena operates without the filters of fear or manipulation, a stark contrast to the criminal underworld Julia escaped. She demands an immediate debrief, expressing her opinions exactly 3 seconds after forming them. Julia categorizes Matteo's behavior as strange, specifically because he offered a genuine apology rather than a narcissistic deflection. This deviation requires intense cognitive processing. Serena sits down, assuming the role of an emotional auditor. Julia reveals the core of his confession, the staggering admission that he managed her like a logistical problem. Let us remember a crucial lesson here. When a captor suddenly adopts the vocabulary of their victim, it is rarely a cure. It is often simply the deployment of a more sophisticated mask. Recognizing the harm is only the first step. The rare silence from Serena speaks volumes. She asks the most critical diagnostic question: do you actually believe him? Julia's response is highly analytical. She states that believes he genuinely believes his own narrative in this moment, but belief does not equal fundamental behavioral change. Serena astutely shifts Deja's chodibizzi. It is not about his potential for redemption, but whether Julia is willing to step back into the blast radius. 3 days pass in this state of hypervigilance. Then the quarantine is breached. An unrecognized number flashes on the screen. 18 months of Naf living adjacent to a Mafia empire had conditioned her amygdala to instantly recognize an anomaly. She answers. A smooth, unfamiliar voice addresses her. The external world has violently intruded on her fragile sanctuary. Let us examine the anatomy of a threat. The voice on the phone was a calculated instrument, weaponizing the name she had tried to abandon. Her grip on the receiver tightened, an involuntary fight or flight response. "Who is this?" she demanded, her pulse accelerating. "A mutual acquaintance," the voice purred, "specifically of your husband, or soon-to-be former husband. We would like to have a conversation." When she refused, the caller's false polish fractured, revealing the predatory core beneath. "The baby is going to be a Rinaldi," the voice stated. "That makes the child relevant to certain interests." Her blood went completely to ice. "Do not call this number again," she ordered, slamming the phone down. "You and I know that ignoring a predator never makes them disappear. It only forces them to change their angle of attack." For 30 seconds, she sat in a state of clinical shock. Then, displaying the classic trauma bond of Stockholm Syndrome, she called the very man she had fled. Matteo answered on the first ring. "I have been waiting for you to call," he said. When she relayed the threat, his silence was profound. It was not an empty quiet, but the terrifyingly rapid cognitive processing of an apex predator running variables. A man's voice, he noted, demanding details. "Mid-40s, she replied, with a southern, perhaps Calabrian accent. The ensuing silence was suffocating. When he finally spoke her name, the apologetic, vulnerable mask he wore in public had vanished entirely. This was the voice of the kingpin, the cold, absolute authority she had heard making brutal decrees in the dead of night. His tone was absolute, demanding total submission. "Listen to me carefully," he instructed, telling her she had to return to Milan. When she protested, he executed a textbook manipulation tactic, pivoting the focus entirely to external danger to bypass her defenses. "Someone accessed your unlisted number," he warned, "which means your new apartment is already compromised." Subconsciously, she moved her hand to protect her unborn child, a primal maternal reflex. "Who are these people?" she asked. His hesitation revealed the depth of the danger. "People waiting for leverage," he admitted. He confessed to managing a volatile situation for 4 months, falsely believing he had it contained. In the criminal mind, the illusion of control is paramount, and losing it is their greatest fear. Look, a narcissist rarely offers the truth unless it serves a distinct purpose. "Your situation?" she asked. "The kind handled at midnight in gardens?" For the first time, he offered zero deflection. He promised no more lies, asking if she would return. As if responding to the psychological weight of the moment, the child shifted within her. "I will come," she conceded, the next morning. It was not a low-level enforcer who arrived, but Enzo himself. He pulled up outside the building at 9, a black sedan, bringing hot coffee, ejecting a stabilizing, quiet demeanor. Enzo represented the classic trusted lieutenant, the steady anchor that normalizes the madness of the kingpin's world, making the unacceptable feel a completely safe and routine to a terrified victim. We must look at the friend, Serena, who immediately declared she was joining them. Enzo accepted this variable without a fight, a clear indicator of the rigid, high-stakes orders he was operating under. The drive to Milan was clinically silent. Serena dozed, but Indro drove with the hypervigilance of a soldier ferrying a high-value asset. Julia stared at the asphalt, her mind caught in a dissociative loop. "He did not sleep," Enzo murmured, breaking the silence. He reported that Matteo had been orchestrating defensive maneuvers until 4 in the morning. "You do not need to tell me that," Julia replied defensively. This is a common dynamic, the enforcer subtly reinforcing the captor's devotion, binding the victim tighter to the very source of her trauma. Let us unpack this interaction together because the psychological framing here is crucial. "I am telling you anyway," Enzo insisted. Julia realized Matteo had ordered him to watch her in Turin. "I was confirming you were safe," Enzo countered. utilizing the same semantic defense the Kingpin used. Stripped of Matteo's gravitas, Julia found it difficult to reject the narrative.
Enzo gently probed about the pregnancy, and she admitted she was waiting until she felt secure. He is not an easy man to be sure around, Enzo validated, noting that in 16 years of service,
he had never seen the boss so destabilized. He blamed himself, Enzo added, noting it was not the typical, superficial guilt of a powerful man. It was an obsessive, consuming self-reproach. Typically, a narcissist will briefly acknowledge fault before redirecting the blame outward, but Matteo had simply sat with the guilt. Julia maintained a blank affect, though her hand sought her unborn child once more. Arriving at the estate, we see the architectural manifestation of the Kingpin's psyche: stone, iron, and a sprawling gravel drive. The autumn gardens were rigid and formal, possessing a cold, commanding beauty that demanded compliance. She had anticipated feeling alienated upon returning to this fortress after 6 months away. Instead, the smell of old wood and polished stone triggered a deeply conditioned emotional response. It felt terrifyingly familiar. Returning to a toxic environment often feels like slipping into a warm, dangerous bath. Matteo waited deep inside the foyer rather than at the front door. Displaying eagerness would be a loss of power, a vulnerability his pathology simply could not permit. He stood near the grand staircase, the sleeves rolled to expose the dark territorial ink marking his skin. His eyes locked onto her, then dropped immediately to her changed body. A micro-expression of profound, consuming possession flashed across his features and vanished. "Thank you for coming," he offered. "I did not return for you," she fired back, drawing a boundary. "I came for my child." Our child," he corrected softly, an immediate reassertion of ownership. He had prepared the east bedroom for her, carefully avoiding the phrase "your room." Even a Monza knows when to soften his grip. "You remembered I prefer the east light," she noted. "I remember everything," he replied, his tone devoid of theatricality. This hyper-retention of detail is classic grooming behavior. It makes the subject feel entirely enveloped. After dinner, calibrated perfectly to her pregnancy, right down to an ergonomically elevated chair, he requested she join him for a walk. He framed it as not a demand, giving her the illusion of autonomy. They ventured into the garden, the skeletal trees looming overhead. He maintained a rigidly respectful physical distance, signaling a temporary suspension of his usual dominance. It is a brilliant, terrifying adaptation. "Tell me about the threat," she demanded, stepping willingly into his web. "You and I know that when a megalomaniac admits a weakness, it is almost always a calculated strike. His name is Duca," Matteo explained, detailing a 2-year territorial war he claimed perfectly contained. 3 months ago, enemy shifted tactics from direct assault to seeking psychological pressure points. "Meaning me," Julia deduced instantly. He confirmed that the rival syndicate believed Matteo would sacrifice his empire for her survival. They were entirely correct. He stated without a fraction of hesitation, bringing their walk to a dead halt. When she begged him not to say such things, he refused to retreat. He insisted she deserved the raw truth over a mask of calm calculation. It is the ultimate romanticization of violent obsession. She stared up at him, his features obscured by the shadows of the estate. "That is exactly the kind of statement that makes this impossible to navigate," she whispered. "I know," he replied, leaning into the vulnerability. Above them, the winter sky was an abyss. Consider the profound cognitive dissonance at play here. Julia had fled this very garden months ago with absolute, unshakable certainty. that she was escaping a monster. Now, standing in the freezing dark, she felt the rigid walls of her conviction beginning to fracture. The trauma bond was reestablishing its neural pathways. Terrified by her own internal surrender, she abruptly turned away, claiming she needed to sleep. He agreed instantly, promising to outline his tactical defense in the morning. She retreated toward the heavy doors of the estates, pausing on the threshold. "Thank you for making this about the child and not about us," she murmured without looking back. "He is always going to be the priority," Mateo swore to her, regardless of whether she ultimately stayed or left. As she disappeared inside, Mateo remained anchored in the frozen garden. The light from the house illuminated the ink on his skin, loyalty above all. For 2 decades, his psychological framework defined loyalty through blood and violence. Now, he was experiencing a profound cognitive restructuring. Julia was back inside the very cage she had desperately escaped, finding her only protection in the arms of her former warden, while an external predator circled the perimeter. In the deep isolation of that winter night, the psychological armor Julia spent months forging finally cracked. We are about to see how external pressure forces a victim to choose between the shadows of their past and the fragile hope of a future. It is a harsh truth in behavioral science. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Sometime around 3 in the morning, her false sense of security shattered completely. She awoke to the sharp, aggressive cadence of rapid Italian drifting up from the courtyard. It was not a domestic dispute. It was the clinical, urgent exchange of soldiers managing a breach. Lying paralyzed in the dark, clutching her unborn child, her analytical mind identified the voices. The war had arrived at their doorstep. Let us open this case file together, shall we? Notice how Julia exhibits classic hypervigilance, a fundamental trauma response. She was out of bed before her conscious mind even registered the decision. Pulling a heavy robe over her nightgown, she approached the window, remaining hidden in the shadows. This is the adaptive survival mechanism of a captive. In the garden, 3 men stood in the dark. Enzo was on the phone. A guard held a photograph. A 3rd man gestured with the frantic, controlled energy of an underling delivering catastrophic news. After 30 seconds of clinical observation, Julia bypassed all prior marital boundaries and walked straight into Mateo's ground floor study. The lesson here is simple. Fear teaches us the rules, but sheer survival forces us to break them. Mateo stood behind the desk, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled to reveal vivid ink under the harsh study lamps. Both hands pressed flat against the wood as he leaned over a spread of surveillance photographs. When Julia entered, he did not order her out. The older iterations of this megamaniacal narcissist would have demanded absolute compliance and sent her back to bed. Instead, he simply noted that his rival, Duca, had moved faster than anticipated. Julia stepped closer to examine the grainy images. They showed her apartment building in Turin, specifically the interior lobby. The angles proved an operative had breached the perimeter. The psychological reality of the criminal mind is stuck here. Power is not simply about control. It is about knowing when to let your subject see the genuine threat. When she asked for a timeline, Mateo's response was chillingly precise. The photos were taken within 4 hours of her departure. He studied the images, pointing out a blurred but recognizable figure near the elevator. Julia immediately identified her friend Serenissa, her voice spiking with genuine panic. Mateo deployed his neutralizing tactic instantly, assuring her that his operatives had already secured Serena and were bringing her to the estate. Notice the calculated orchestration here. He moved the moment she called him, repositioning his syndicate asset in advance. He anticipated the enemy's escalation, engineering a scenario where he becomes her ultimate protector. If we learn anything from behavioral analysis, it is that the most dangerous predators do not just build the cage. They convince you to lock the door yourself. He informed her that the opposing syndicate was monitoring their communication channels. Her presence at his estate fundamentally shifted the tactical landscape. When Julia asked for clarification, Matteo presented his logic with a sociopathic calm. The estate was simply more defensible than her isolated apartment. The lamplight caught the script tattooed on his forearm, the ink shifting with his muscle tension. He explained that Duca wanted leverage. In Turin, she was an unprotected asset. Here, she was guarded by 30 armed men ready to die before letting an intruder breach the perimeter. This is a textbook isolation strategy. The subject is removed from all external support and made entirely reliant on the captor. True manipulation rarely looks like a threat. It usually looks like a fortress keeping the monsters out. He justifies the tense security by ceding her status. She was his wife, and critically to his dynastic ego, she was carrying his son. He held her gaze with an intensity designed to trigger emotion. But Julia stepped back. She demanded the tactical plan, actively resisting the trauma bond trying to establish itself. Fascinatingly, Matteo adapted. The formidably intelligent kingpin took over. For the first time in their dynamic, he walked her through his strategy, without condescension or omission. He explains that Nojar's faction had expanded north, intruding on his territory. Matteo recognized that transparency was currently his most effective tool for compliance. We must remember that growth requires abandoning old defenses, but for a true megalomaniac, even brutal honesty is merely another calculated weapon. Matteo B. detailed his prior conflict resolution models. He had managed the syndicate tension through strategic withdrawal to succeeding specific interests to avoid an all-out street war. But a criminal profile dictates that ambition always outgrows concession. Duca wanted the northern distribution network, an asset Matteo refused to surrender. When denied, Duca shifted to psychological leverage, specifically targeting Julia and the unborn child. You can see the dark triad traits activating within Matteo here. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He revealed he was organizing a coalition with 3 other crime families. He had delayed this alliance because it required a massive blow to his narcissism. In this dangerous environment, an inflated ego is a fatal liability. You can either protect your pristine pride, or you can protect your actual life. Julia rightly identified the delay as an admission of vulnerability. She pointed out that his overwhelming pride nearly resulted in her death. Matteo did not flinch or deflect, which is a significant deviation from standard narcissistic behavior. He acknowledged her assessment with cold honesty, admitting he was attempting a new psychological approach. There was a ghost of a smile between them, a shared recognition of his severe pathology. Julia looked at his heavily tattooed hands resting on the desk and asked what role she was to play. His response revealed a rare flicker of genuine gratitude. And let him neutralize the threat. When she challenged this familiar protective phrasing, he insisted the context had changed. Even a deeply flawed individual can draw the truth, provided that the truth perfectly serves their ultimate master plan. He provided a fascinating clarification of his control mechanics. In the past, handling a situation meant isolating her behind closed doors, a classic method of maintaining absolute dominance. Now, he framed his actions as a pragmatic division of labor. He would execute the violent tasks suited to his sociopathic skill set, while she focused on preserving herself and the child. He explicitly stated this was not due to her incompetence, but purely logical resource management. Julia processed this cognitive reframing. She recognized it as a slightly more reasonable version of his core possessive instinct. Matteo agreed, admitting that his primal neural pathways do not rewire overnight. She nearly reached out to touch him, the trauma bond pulling at her empathy, but she caught herself. We must evaluate every relationship objectively. An upgraded cage is still fundamentally a cage. Instead of yielding to the emotional pull, Julia instructed him to rest before he needed to be tactically useful. Her ability to compartmentalize is remarkable. Matteo looked at her with an expression devoid of his usual defenses, a rare moment of psychological exposure. She turned away, leaving him standing in the study with his unresolved ego and the heavy burden of his violent syndicate. By 6 in the morning, the collateral damage arrived. Serena was escorted in, radiating the righteous indignation of a civilian dragged into an active mob dispute. Over breakfast, Julia finally broke her long pattern of secrecy. She laid out the absolute truth about Matteo's criminal reality. Secrecy is the ultimate oxygen of toxic relationships. Once you bring the stark truth into the daylight, the dangerous illusion instantly begins to suffocate and die.
You and I should pay close attention to Serena's reaction here. She absorbed the staggering reality of the estate and immediately diagnosed the core psychological anchor. She pointed out that Julia still loved the kingpin. It was a clinical observation, not a question. Julia admitted to this emotional attachment against all logic and self-preservation.
Serena astutely noted that human attachment rarely requires empirical evidence it sustains itself. Julia countered by acknowledging the profound emotional damage Matteo had caused. Recognizing his negligent cruelty was just as destructive as intentional malice. Serena asked the crucial diagnostic question, had his fundamental baseline actually changed? Rationalizing abuse is the first true symptom of psychological captivity. We cling to the ghost of who we want them to be, completely ignoring the dangerous reality they consistently show us.
Julia processed the evidence. She considered his unprecedented transparency in the study, his willingness to concede rather than conquer. She concluded that he had altered his approach.
But when Serena probed deeper into her residual anxiety, Julia revealed a profound psychological insight. Resting her hands on her abdomen, feeling the somatic connection to her child, she voiced her deepest fear. She worried this behavioral shift was purely situational. Matteo was cornered by external syndicate threats, and her pregnancy, adopting honesty only because his usual manipulative tools were currently in effect. Serena pressed her to define what empirical proof she needed to trust this change. We must remember that a temporary mask is never a permanent cure. Real transformation does not happen because a predator is trapped. It happens when they are completely free and still actively choose not to bite. Julia could not provide an answer. Establishing a new baseline for trust requires time. 3 days into her reintegration into the estate, Matteo convened a major tactical meeting. Julia engaged in a highly effective psychological strategy, boundary setting. She deliberately chose not to attend, recognizing that observing a malignant ecosystem from a distance is different from being consumed by it. For 4 hours, she listened to the muffled syndicate voices bleeding through the heavy doors. Later, Matteo sought her out in the sitting room. He sat across from her, dropping his physical defenses, leaning forward with his tattooed forearms resting on his knees, he stared at the floor. Setting firm boundaries is never about controlling a dangerous person's chaotic behavior. It is simply about building an impenetrable wall to protect your own mental stability and absolute peace of mind. Matteo outlined the ultimatum delivered to his rival. Duca could voluntarily retreat and accept the territorial boundaries he previously rejected, or the new crime coalition would violently enforce his withdrawal. Julia assessed the behavioral profile, concluding Duca would submit. Megalomaniacs are not inherently suicidal. They overextend until reality violently corrects them. Duca's attack on Julia was a symptom of narcissistic collapse, a desperate flailing. But as Julia correctly noted, severe desperation breeds extreme unpredictability. Matteo validated her caution, confirming the 30 armed operatives would remain stationed around the perimeter until the treaty was verified. She slowly turned her book over, grounding herself in the moment. True security is never trusting the word of a cornered predator. It is making absolute certain you have the tactical leverage to guarantee they stay securely in their cage. Let us open this case file together, shall we?
You and I are going to dissect the anatomy of control. When she stated her need to return to Turin, the kingpin simply said, "I know." He repeated it,
dropping his vocal registers to feign emotional cost. "I am not going to try to keep you here," he told her, masking a command as a concession. He claimed his prior threats were merely about safety.
"The lesson here is
simple.
Never confuse a predator's concession with true freedom. The tragedy of Stockholm Syndrome is that the victim inevitably wants to believe the captor."
She felt an uncomfortable certainty. Then came the pivot. When the baby arrives, he asked, "Would you be willing to be in Milan? Not here, but close."
He framed his request with calculated vulnerability. Not at the estate he offered of autonomy, city. He deliberately fractured his sentence.
"Close enough that I do not miss things." When she asked things, he deployed his physical tells, averting his gaze as the dark ink on his throat shifted as he swallowed. "I missed 6 months,"
he said, laying the guilt bare. "It teaches us something vital. The most dangerous traps are the ones we willingly step into. The silence between them was clinical, heavy with compliance."
"I will think about it," she replied. It was the same phrase from the divorce office, but the psychological tether had reattached. The legal agreement finalized. Morning routines often serve a grounding technique for trauma survivors. She had begun pacing the gravel paths of the garden, using the biting November cold as a sensory anchor to clear the cognitive dissonance from her mind. Sometimes the clearest thoughts only arrive when we step out into the freezing truth. He appeared at the doorway, jacket discarded, the morning light illuminating the tattoos on his forearms, a display of dominant posturing. "It is done," he announced. He did not look relieved, because a megalomaniac does not permit himself the vocabulary of fear. Yet his baseline tension had dropped. "Serena?" she asked, deflecting. She can leave whenever she chooses," he replied, noting she was safe now. The involuntary laugh that escaped her is what behavioral analysts call an emotion leak. It surprised them both. He watched her with an unguarded expression she recognized from their wedding, a rare, uncalculated slip of the mask before the sociopathic defenses re-engaged. She quickly suppressed the laugh, anchoring her eyes to the gravel. "I am going to go home soon," she stated, clinging to her. Reminds us that true boundaries are built in the mind before they are spoken aloud. "Oh," he replied, his voice calculated calm. She looked up and realized he had closed the distance without making a sound. He stood near her, occupying her orbit, It is a spatial domination tactic, making everything else fade. His throat ink was from her face, a silent reminder of his criminal authority. I have something to say, he told her, immediately establishing the rules of engagement. I need you to let me speak without building a counter-argument. Notice how he invalidates her psychological defenses. Here is a simple truth. Anyone who demands you stop thinking is preparing to manipulate you. She froze, a classic prey response. I am listening. He drew a breath, his hands twitching as he suppressed the urge to physically handle her.
When I stood at that window in the office, he said, and I saw you, I want to be honest.
Everything went quiet, he continued, describing the neurological detachment of a predator preparing to strike. Stick with me, here we are, about to uncover how a sociopath justifies his own cruelty. I understood in that moment, he told her, that I had made the defining mistake of my life. Not by letting you leave, but by making leaving your only rational choice. It is a masterful mimicry of accountability. He painted a picture of a man who built a dangerous syndicate world, claiming he tried to protect her by keeping her adjacent to it. But adjacent to a fire is still close enough to burn, he noted. I am asking because I am no longer the man who spoke to you like a dictator rather than a human being. A narcissist will always rewrite history to win. The lesson is clear. An apology without changed behavior is just manipulation. I know I have to earn your trust back, he said, layering his performance with acceptable pauses. His jaw tightened, simulating emotional struggle. I know you may decide the time is not worth it, and I will accept that. He offered total compliance, the ultimate for woman starved of agency. I will be his father regardless, in whatever arrangement you can tolerate. He locked eyes with her, executing the final psychological blow. You are not a room in my house, he whispered. You were the reason the house had any meaning. We must remember that being valued as a possession is not the same as being loved. The wind rustled the barren trees. Her pulse hammered in her throat, her trauma bond completely reactivated. She stared at the apex predator standing before her. To her conditioned mind, he was an enormous, complicated, tattooed puzzle. She saw a man who had systematically dismantled her reality, now attempting to dissect the architecture of his own failure. You hurt me, she finally said. I know, he replied. Not just once, she pushed back, but repeatedly, through the arrogant belief that controlling my safety was the exact thing as loving me. The hardest lesson in life is learning that love should never feel like a survival situation. I know, he repeated. Stop saying you know, she demanded. Genuine affect. Say something real. Tattooed joints of his fingers shifted. I am terrified, he confessed into the cold air. I have not said those words to a living soul in 20 years, he admitted. Let us pause here for a moment, you and I. This is where the behavioral mask slips, revealing the absolute core of the pathology. I say it because you asked for something real, he insisted. And when she asked what exactly he feared, his answer was clinically fascinating. That I will do it again, he told her, not by intention, but through deeply wired patterns. That he would manage instead of yell out love, that he would control rather than trust. She held his gaze, recognizing the profound damage in his neural pathways. It shows us a stark reality. Insight without action is just a delayed tragedy. The biological drive to control was woven into his very DNA. At least you are aware of it, she offered, granting him a sliver of absolution. Awareness is not a cure, he agreed, but it is a start. Then a shift occurred. The unborn child rolled within her, an involuntary biological response to the deep resonance of the father's voice. Without running it through her cognitive filters, she spoke. He moves a lot when your voice is around. she murmured. The body always speaks the truth, even when the mind tries to hide it. The kingpin froze. It was a raw, unfiltered truth that bypassed every one of his psychological defenses. His meticulously crafted composure completely shattered. He stared at her abdomen, stripping away decades of violent, untouchable syndicate authority in an instant. "Can I?" he whispered, unable to finish the sentence. The absolute submission of a sociopath is a rare and haunting phenomenon. She understood the unspoken plea and took his hand. The violent ink on his knuckles was starkly warm against her skin as she guided his palm to the crest of her abdomen. They waited in the cold morning air. The baby rolled again. This man, an overlord whose mere name dictated the survival of lesser criminals, exhaled a ragged breath and closed his eyes. His massive hand remained flawlessly still. "He is incredibly strong," the mobster murmured. He opened his eyes, shifting his clinical focus back to her face. "True strength is not measured by the power to destroy, but by the restraint not to use it." He read the total lack of psychological armor in her expression. He started. "Do not," she pleaded, her emotional regulation failing her entirely. "I am not going to say anything," he promised, his breathing shallow and uneven. Happened to me. His hand applied a microscopic fraction of pressure. "You are the most vital person in my existence," he stated. "I am stating a factual reality I should have voiced 2 years ago." Overwhelmed by the trauma bond, she bypassed her own instincts, leaning forward to rest her forehead against him. We must never let our deep empathy override our basic self-preservation. Yet she did exactly that. Now, pay close attention to this final behavioral exchange. It was not a full embrace. It was merely a collapse of boundaries, a desperate need to not feel entirely isolated. He did not wrap his arms around her. He stood with the agonizing stillness of a man holding a glass explosive. His thumb stroked her just once. Finally, she withdrew, smoothing her coat to re-establish her physical barrier. "I am going back to Turin," she stated, her vocal cords steadying. He accepted this with silence. And then she added, "I will think about Milan. Here is the lesson we must all remember. True healing requires distance because staying near the source of your pain will only guarantee you keep bleeding. The captive forever tied to the captor. Let's open the case file. You and I are going to unpack this behavioral shift together. The subject, Matteo, displays classic adaptations of a megalomaniac narcissist realizing his previous mechanisms of control have failed. When Julia rejects his estate, he pivots instantly. "Whatever you need," he offers, masking his desperation as accommodation. He recognizes his own manipulative negotiations, yet there is a calculated warmth now. She keeps her boundary, not yet, but not never. Returning to Turin, she secures a 4th-floor apartment with west-facing windows and space for a nursery. She chooses isolation to regain autonomy. The clinical lesson here is profoundly simple. True peace is never handed to you by your captor, something you must actively choose and build for yourself. She dismantles her temporary refuge in Serena's spare room, fueled by a 4-hour dinner, heavy wine, and the kind of raw honesty trauma victims rarely allow themselves. At 30 weeks, her obstetrician confirms the infant is vigorous. She maintains a strict informational embargo against Matteo, releasing only a single psychological trigger, a photograph of the nursery corner bathed in afternoon light. His response is a textbook display of narcissistic injury. 3 words, hell. He cannot stand being excluded from his own legacy. She studies that text, decoding his psychological fracture, and quietly begins searching for territory closer to him in Milan. Sometimes the most profound life lesson we learn is that silence is the sharpest weapon against someone who demands control. The Navigli district apartment is everything his estate is not. High ceilings, ancient tiles, and morning light pouring through a courtyard. A complete structural deviation from her trauma environment. When she informs him of the malign move, the silence on the line is heavy with tactical reassessment. He may note she is moving right before her 34th week, the medical deadline for travel. He immediately insists on I am sending his people to move her. I'll strongly suggest. He corrects, softening his authoritarian instinct. He asks to inspect the predator. When I'm settled, she deflects. The lesson here is fundamental to survival. When rebuilding your identity after a profound psychological fracture, you must fiercely protect your new boundaries before letting anyone back inside. Here is where the dynamic fractures further. She confronts him about Valentina Greco, the woman at the gate. Notice how he pauses, carefully curating his confession. He admits to a prior entanglement, claiming he severed it completely when their relationship began. He confesses to mishandling her reappearance, a rare admission of error from a man accustomed to absolute authority. But the victim's hypervigilance has sharpened. She connects Valentina to the timing of the rival Duca syndicate's movements. His silence stretches. He is genuinely shocked by her deductive reasoning. The enduring life lesson in this exchange is undeniable. Never underestimate the observational power of someone who has spent their life analyzing the subtle, dangerous behavioral patterns of those in power. I was a bookkeeper's daughter, she reminds him, asserting her own analytical superiority. Numbers and patterns are her defense mechanisms. Matteo quietly confesses that Valentina systematically leaked vulnerabilities as date layouts, access points, and schedules. She is no longer in a position to be a problem, he states, a chilling euphemism for elimination. When Julia points out his deception, he weaponizes guilt. You had left me. He admits his deep shame that his misplaced trust became a target on his wife's back. Former wife, she corrects. He reminds her the divorce papers remain unsigned. The lesson is brutally clear. Secrets kept in the name of protection are almost always an illusion of control, designed only to serve the psychological comfort of the one keeping them. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? She blinks, the cognitive dissonance hitting her. He is entirely correct. Her lawyer Ferrante had filed an extension, subconsciously delaying the absolute severing of their trauma bond. No, I haven't, she admits. The silence between them is thick, carrying the gravitational pull of their toxic codependency. December arrives with biting cold as she relocates to the Navigli apartment. 32 weeks pregnant, wrapped in a tight... She watches his discreet men orchestrate her move. They call her Sonora. They ask no questions.
The profound lesson hidden in this mundane transition is this. Sometimes we deliberately delay our escapes, leaving the psychological door unlocked,
hoping the ghost we are running from will finally change. By noon, his operatives have perfectly arranged her sanctuary. By 3 o'clock, the nursery corner is a meticulously curated display of autonomy. A soft grey rug, a crisp white dresser, and a wooden mobile all ordered months prior in Turin. Standing there, she experiences a rare neurological elation of safety. It is not his fortified estate, nor Serena's pity room. This territory is exclusively hers. She initiates contact. I'm settled. She offered him an invitation for lunch the following day. He insists on bringing provisions. Let me bring food, he demands, masking his need to provide as care. The crucial life lesson we observe here is that taking ownership of your physical environment is the first mandatory step reclaiming your psychological sovereignty from a captor. She stands alone, surveying the high ceilings and the infant's corner awaiting a life just 7 weeks away. For the first time, her psychological footing feels entirely grounded. Precisely at the subject arrives. He wears a dark coat, sleeves uncharacteristically rolled down, though the neck tattoo remains a visible threat indicator. He brings a meal from a Brera district restaurant she had fleetingly mentioned 18 months prior. The megalomaniac never forgets a detail that can be leveraged for affection. Upon entry, his eyes sweep the architecture in under 3 seconds, cataloging sightlines, vulnerabilities, and exit routes. The simple lesson in this behavior is stark. People rarely change their survival instincts. They only change the environment where they deploy them. His threat assessment complete, he finally processes the emotional weight of the room, the natural light, the canal view, the carefully constructed nursery corner. He anchors himself before the small white dresser and the wooden mobile, hands buried in his pockets. Bessie. "It's good," he murmurs. "I know," she replies, a quiet manifestation of her reclaimed power. He almost smiles. They sit at her modest kitchen table, consuming the impeccably sourced cuisine. He would never allow mediocrity into his orbit. They begin negotiating names from her curated list of 3. The clinical lessons embedded in this domestic scene is powerful. True equality in any relationship only begins when both parties sit down at a table where neither holds the absolute power to lock the door behind them. He listens with that terrifying, absolute hyperfixation he uses to dismantle rival flying tickets, now applying it to infant names. He counters with 3 choices, sparking a negotiation reminiscent of the earliest encounters. It is the classic dance of Stockholm Syndrome evolving into mutual leverage. When the plates are cleared, the psychological atmosphere shifts. It is palpable, like a long-sealed vault cracking open to let in a cold draft. "I need to tell you something," she states. She confesses that her initial fight in January was not merely a tactical retreat driven by a lack of rational alternatives. The life lesson here is one we all must swallow. Running away from a situation is completely if you do not simultaneously confront the terror of why you stayed so long. Stick with me. This is where the clinical diagnosis gets fascinating. She stares at her hands, admitting the deepest layer of her trauma bond. She wasn't just running from his criminal empire. She was terrified by the sheer magnitude of her attachment to him. She feared loving a narcissist so deeply while remaining utterly invisible in his shadow. She was terrified of losing her cognitive dissonance, unable to separate genuine affection from a prolonged hostage situation. She needed geographical distance to prove her free will. "And now," she says, looking directly into his predatory eyes, "I am choosing. The lesson is absolute. Love only has true value when it is selected freely, rather than accepted as a coping mechanism for an environment you cannot physically escape." The silence in the room swells, heavy and charged. Slowly, deliberately, his tattooed hand crosses the table to eclipse hers. It is not a grip or the possessive clutch of a captor. It is merely a warm, specific covering.
"Julia," he murmurs, stripping the of its manipulative. "I know we can't go back," she states firmly, cementing her psychological boundary. "Neither am I," he replies.
"I want something new." She demands that this new foundation be built on entirely different terms. He invites her to dictate those terms. She flips her hand, pressing her palm against his knuckle tattoos. "Honesty," she demands. The defining life lesson in this moment is clear. If you are to rebuild Browen Foundation using the exact same emotional bricks, it will inevitably collapse again. She outlines her non-negotiable boundaries, dismantling his narcissistic control mechanisms one by one. No decisions without her active consent. No suffocating protection disguised as love. This independent apartment remains hers. She demands he learn to sit in a room with her without trying to analytically solve her. That will be the hardest one, he admits, maintaining direct eye contact. His thumb traces hers and also mirroring the possessive intimacy he once showed her in the garden. Yes, to all of it, he surrenders. I am not negotiating. I am agreeing. The most profound life lesson we can extract from this psychological case file is this. True surrender from a person accustomed to absolute power is the only valid currency of change. Everything else is just a delayed trap. Let's open this case file together, you and I, and examine the behavioral patterns of what many would call a megalomaniac narcissist and the woman all caught in his orbit. We start their final phase in January, exactly 1 year after Julia severed their trauma. A suitcase, her body forced a new variable. She went into labor 2 weeks early. A classic stress response. She called Matteo while her prefrontal cortex was still managing her panic, stating simply that it was time. He arrived in 11 minutes. Clinically speaking, 11 minutes is impossible from his compound. He had been circling her perimeter, hypervigilance disguised as protection. The lesson here is simple proximity does not equal safety, even when it feels exactly like it. When she opened the door, she observed a man masking profound internal chaos. His coat was worn undone, sleeves rolled to expose the territorial ink on his forearms and neck, a kingpin's camouflage. His facial micro-expressions were rigidly suppressed, but his pupils betrayed him entirely. He didn't command her. He simply offered his arm, a calculated shift from coercion to voluntary compliance, a key component in reinforcing Stockholm Syndrome. She took it. The subsequent hours in the maternity ward dissolved into a psychological fugue state. Time warped the way trauma often dictates. Serena arrived from Milan, carrying Julia on one side while Matteo anchored the other. Sometimes the most dangerous moments of our lives are survived simply by letting someone hold our hand. In a high-stakes clinical setting, men with antisocial personality features usually escalate. They demand control to mitigate their own anxiety. But Matteo presented an anomaly. He did not issue threats or try to manipulate the medical staff. He remained exactly where Julia positioned him. When her pain shattered her carefully construct emotional walls, he didn't offer for performative dominance. He simply leaned in and anchored her identity, just her name. He called her the bravest person in the room, and the cognitive dissonance in her brain quieted. She believed him completely. Their son was delivered as Wednesday morning broke. True transformation, you see, rarely announces itself with a loudspeaker. It is usually found in the quiet choice to finally listen. Let us analyze this specific moment of attachment. The infant's first cry was sharp and indignant. When the kingpin finally held his child, his physical posturing dissolved. He pressed this fragile new life against his chest, right over the violent gang insignia that had defined his entire pathological existence. For the first time in their 3-year clinical history, his face lost all defensive architecture. He was completely unguarded. He whispered to the child that he would do better. It was not a manipulation tactic aimed at Julia. It was a raw, unmedicated vow. We must remember that even within the darkest psychological frameworks, the instinct to protect our young can rewrite the brain's deepest wiring, offering a small, vital window for genuine change. Julia observed him with a hyper-awareness born of trauma. She read the ink on his skin loyalty above everything else. Her internal dialogue noted his lifelong allegiance to violence. Yet she registered a cognitive shift in him. 2 days they were discharged. Matteo drove them to her apartment, pointedly avoiding his fortified compound. Listen, stripping away one's territory is a profound veneer surrender besound. He arranged the nursery with obsessive efficiency, proving he'd been covertly preparing for this domestic reality. He prepared her coffee, standing at the edge of the room like a sentinel observing a life he was not yet permitted to enter. The most profound respect we can show a survivor is honoring the boundaries they build to keep themselves safe. He offered to leave, executing a textbook retreat to give her agency. When she asked him to stay for dinner, his mask slipped completely. His response was visceral and immediate. They shared a meal in careful, measured tones, the auditory signature of 2 deeply guarded individuals laying a new psychological foundation. When exhaustion finally overtook her, she fell asleep in his presence. This indicates a massive reduction in her sympathetic nervous system's threat response. He covered her, sitting vigil in the dim room before departing. He left a note, replacing the trauma of her previous abandonment letter with a gesture of stability.
Real intimacy
Is never rushed. It is built brick by slow brick, entirely out of moments where we choose not to run away. You and I know that behavioral extinction is a slow process, but his note was clear. I will wait for your readiness. In the weeks that followed, Matteo practiced profound restraint. He only entered her space when explicitly invited. Julia constantly monitored him for signs of regression. Her brain was still wired for survival, scanning for his old manipulative tactics or commanding tone. Instead, she witnessed an apex predator systematically dismantling his own instincts. He communicated without strategic omission. He soothed his infant son with a deliberate gentleness that forced Julia to look away, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of it. Trust cannot be demanded by force. It must be earned through the quiet, exalted repetition of showing up without an agenda. He began anticipating her needs, a subtle but vital distinction from his previous habit of dictating them. 6 weeks postpartum, her psychological evaluation of him reached a tipping point. She initiated contact with Ferrante, the attorney. She instructed him to withdraw her legal petitions. The lawyer paused, processing the clinical shift in her neurobiology. The bond had mutated once again, but this time from a place of conscious agency rather than coerced survival. Ferrante agreed to terminate the paperwork, acting with the weary precision of a man familiar with the underworld's complex emotional cycles. We often think of forgiveness as a singular event, but it is actually a series of tiny, terrifying choices to drop our weapons and see what happens next. She chose a remarkably ordinary Sunday to present him with the legal withdrawal. No grand theatrics, just a quiet apartment, a sleeping infant, and the fading light. When he read the document, she established a warning him not to misinterpret her action. He stopped her, that this was not absolution, but merely a continuation of their trial period. That level of radical acceptance from a narcissist is clinically fascinating. She commanded him to approach. He stopped just short of her personal space, his violent gang tattoos highly visible under the kitchen lights. True strength is not found in never getting hurt. It is found in looking directly at the source of your deepest scars and deciding that the fear no longer controls you. Bypassing the armor of his tailored suit and the ink that marked his criminality, She pressed her palm directly over his sternum. She vocalized a profound psychological boundary. She was not absolving his past pathology, but rather consciously selecting his present iteration. He trapped her hand against his accelerating heart rate, his tattooed knuckles radiating heat. He stated his intention to spend his remaining lifespan proving his behavioral shift. When they kissed, the dopamine rush was fundamentally different from their initial trauma bond. It lacked the frantic, survivalist edge. It was deliberate, heavy with the gravity of earned trust. Sometimes, healing does not mean forgetting the monster. It means recognizing that the monster has finally learned how to bleed. Let us examine the new rules of engagement they drafted in that moment. She maintained her physical independence. The apartment would remain her exclusive territory. He accepted this loss of spatial dominance instantly. She demanded a continuous behavioral modification, and he agreed to daily compliance. A subtle vocalization from their infant broke the silence. Matteo did not react impulsively. He waited for Julia's non-verbal authorization before approaching the crib. She observed this massive, dangerous man cradle his son with surgical care. The kingpin, who once viewed the world purely as territory to be conquered, was now entirely subjugated by a 6-pound child. We must recognize that the most unbreakable chains we wear are the ones we willingly wrap around ourselves. Julia stood alone at the window, mirroring his earlier vulnerability. Beyond the glass, the city of Milan maintained its cold, practical indifference, completely unaware of the neurological rewiring occurring in that room. They were not repairing their old, toxic dynamic. They were constructing a completely mildly new psychological architecture from entirely different materials. She had fundamentally altered the geometry of a criminal's mind. She allows to embrace this new reality, not with blind naivety, but with the high, clear vision of a survivor who remembers exactly how deeply the fractures went. That you cannot rebuild a broken foundation by pretending the cracks aren't there. You survive by learning exactly like how to build a house that knows how to weather the storm. As we close this case file, consider the lighting in that room. The nursery lamp illuminated a man who had spent decades enforcing compliance through fear, now utterly disarmed by his own infant. Across the room where Julia held the power, she had secured the environment, dictated the terms, and forced a megalomaniac to adapt to her reality. Loyalty above all, his gunman Tron finally took on an entirely different, non-lethal definition. Thank you for examining this behavioral breakdown with me today. If this psychological dissection intrigued you ensure you engage with by liking and subscribing below. Did you anticipate his cognitive shift, or did his pathology seem too permanent? Drop your clinical theories in the comments. I will see you in our next investigation. This story carries a meaningful lesson about love, control, forgiveness, and the courage to rebuild a relationship on healthier terms. Julia Key once loved Matteo Rinaldi deeply, but she eventually left him because his world made her feel managed rather than loved. He protected her, provided for her, and remembered every detail about her, but he also kept secrets, made decisions without her, and treated danger as something to hide from her instead of something to interface with her. Her decision to leave while unknowingly pregnant becomes the turning point of both their lives. The first lesson is that love cannot survive when protection becomes control. Matteo believes that keeping Julia separate from his dangerous world is the same as keeping her safe, but Julia experiences it differently. She feels like a room in his house, beautiful, protected, but closed away. This is an important educational message. People do not only need safety, they also need respect, honesty, and involvement in decisions that affect their lives.
Another boss of us best because she stops loving Mateo, she bursts because they ignore herself. Mature but mature should burn painful relationships because love is still love, but love alone is not enough. If the relationship makes one person feel or emotionally unsafe.
Mateo-esque growth is meaningful because he does not simply demand Julia-esque return. At first, his instinct is still to command, protect, and manage. But slowly, he begins to understand the damage he caused. He admits that he handled her like a problem instead of loving her as a person. This is the beginning of true accountability. He does not erase the past with one apology. He starts changing his behavior through patience, honesty, and restraint. The pregnancy adds emotional depth, but the story wisely avoids making the baby a shortcut to reconciliation. Julia does not return simply because she is carrying Mateo's son. She builds her own life, her own apartment, her own stable ground. This teaches that a child should never be used as the only reason to repair a relationship. A relationship must be rebuilt because both adults choose healthier terms.
One of the strongest lessons is that forgiveness must come with boundaries. Julia does not say yes. She sets clear terms. She sets her involvement. Protection as an independence that remains hers. Rebuilding trust. Love may open the door, but boundaries
Decide whether it is safe to walk through. For viewers, the message is clear. Real is shown through consistent action, not dramatic promises. Just listening, asking, showing up, and respecting Julia's as independence. Julia's strength comes from knowing she can choose him without losing herself. In the end, the story teaches that love is not about returning to what was broken. It is about building something new with honesty, respect, patience, and the courage to choose each other differently.